I want to introduce our wonderful evening speaker, Ken Meyer, Dr. Ken Meyer. After receiving his PhD in zoology from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill in 1987, Ken Meyer conducted research on imperiled birds in the University of Florida's Department of Wildlife Ecology and Conservation and for the National Park Service. He co-founded Avian Research and Conservation Institute in Gainesville, Florida in 1997 and is currently executive director. While conducting 44 years of avian field research and monitoring and producing management and conservation recommendations, Meyer and his team have studied the behavior and ecology of 21 species of birds of conservation concern in North, Central, and South America and the Caribbean Basin. Welcome, Ken. Let me give you this. Whoop. Yeah. Oh, okay, that is magnetic. So let's see if we can get this in here.
Hi, everybody. Here at the Senior Center and out there in the Zoom universe. I'm Ken Meyer. It's true, and all that was true. I'll vouch for that. Happy to be here and to tell you a little bit about ARCI's work, first with swallowtail kites. These are some of the species that we've studied, and you might be familiar with some of the long-term tracking studies that we've done on swallowtail kites. I started studying them in 1988 and started tracking them with some of the first. We were able to buy 6 of the first 7 successful operating satellite transmitters. 1 went on a peregrine falcon, 6 went on swallowtail kites, and in a matter of a few weeks, it seemed like, a few months, we learned how swallowtail kites migrate, where they go. No, they don't go around the Caribbean or through Mexico. They go across the Gulf. And no, they don't winter in Venezuela or Suriname or Guyana. They winter in southern Brazil, like that. And there are all kinds of stories I would love to tell you about, but I won't tonight, about good fortune hiring 2 great young people because they could speak Spanish, and we knew that the kites were going to South America somewhere, not knowing they were going to wind up in Brazil, where of course they don't speak Spanish, and it's not the same as Portuguese. But one of the 2 people I hired, Audrey Washburn, had dual citizenship, was fluent in Portuguese, and was just the perfect person. That's how things started. So that was in 1996. 1997 started ARCI. And so I want to bring you up to date, not that I expect, there's no test here. You're going to know what we've done since we started studying swallowtail kites. But I do want to show you, where we are at, where the species is at in terms of status. And on all of this work, I'm going to go back immediately here and note my co-author, Gina Kent. Gina started working with ARCI right out of undergraduate biology program in the year 2000. So we've been working together a long time. And she's learned how to do all the kinds of trapping and tagging and banding and sorts of things, and now takes the lead on most of that. So I'm going to start with swallowtail kites. That'll be relatively brief. Then I'm going to move into our study of Southeastern American Kestrels, which we started in 2021. It's ongoing for at least another year or 2, and we're trying to help keep that bird from disappearing. Swallowtail kites, as you know, they migrate a long way. They show up here now, February and March. And what we discovered right away is just studying their nests, looking for their nests on the ground, starting in Big Cypress Swamp in 1988, was that they like large expanses of wet forest. Could be pine, hydric pine, could be cypress, but mature trees, one of which would emerge above the canopy and serve as a good nest for a bird that can glide all day but does not take off for land very gracefully. This is one reason, the main reason. Up in the upper left, the historic range of the swallowtail kite. 21 states, all the way up the Mississippi drainage, nesting in Minnesota and tamarack, larch swamps that far north. But in the around 1900 to 1940, they disappeared, except for what you see in the lower right, 6 or 7, depending on the year, southeastern states. Florida, this is still the range. They have not reoccupied that historic range. Although I will give you some evidence later on, a good story that suggests it's not that they're capable, it's not that they're not capable of growing their population, but they have not resumed using that historic range. And I'll let you think about why that may not have happened, and then I'll tell you. But I think you can think about it in the meantime. It's a good question. It's one of the questions that, types of questions that we enjoy pursuing and understanding. This is a nest in an emergent cypress tree. They almost always lay just 2 eggs, no more, not many, not often more or less. And it's very open to the sky, so it's vulnerable to predation, but it makes it easy for the young when they're ready to fledge to get out of that nest and learn to fly. Also makes it easy for their parents to come in and feed them, because their parents, once they get up in the morning, a swallowtail kite will not land the rest of the day, really, unless the weather gets bad or they're copulating with their mate or something serious. So they need to be able to land, come into a nest as a gliding machine, and suddenly become almost a helicopter and settle onto a nest when there's a lot of wind going on up there. That same wind also is very dangerous for the young birds. They often get blown out of the nest, especially when they're getting close to fledging. They're in the nest about 40 days and they start practicing flying. And if a gust of wind comes along and catches them, we often find dead nestlings at the base of the tree. So only about half the birds that hatch actually make it to fledging. But here's one of the most, there's just a few, 3, I think, most important things that we've learned about swallowtails and what it's brought us to today. Swallowtail kites they can succeed in timber managed lands of the Southeast. And Florida has a lot of this. The Southeastern US is a very, very large still producer, a lucrative industry of producing either wood that's chipped for paper or for 2x4s or for cardboard, et cetera, et cetera. That is probably the biggest factor in why swallowtails have done so well in the Southeast. They didn't have timber companies way back in the past. This is a substitute, but think of it this way. Natural habitat for swallowtail kites, if you get up in the air, is very heterogeneous. Clumps of trees, cypress, small pine islands, in expanses of wetland grasses, sloughs, et cetera, et cetera. They like that habitat diversity because they eat a wide range of prey, insects most of the year, but small vertebrates like tree frogs and tree snakes when they're feeding their young. So they like diverse habitat structure because that produces the diverse prey that they need. These are timber managed lands. Ecologically, this looks the same. Structurally, it does. That will attract the kites. And believe it or not, the diversity in timber managed land is everything from something that was just clear cut, an ugly site, first to say that, all the way up through very, very small trees, and then more trees filling in, up to usually an even age stand has an even top to the forest. But then if you're a wise, sustainable manager, you thin those stands of trees. So every 4th row, maybe every 5th row gets taken out, sold for wood products. What remains immediately starts the divergence height and size of the crown, because taking out that 1 row increases the water supply and the nutrients for the remaining trees. That's good forestry. That works. But it also works for swallowtails. Remember, they like that emergent tree that they can get in and out. That's also high above fire if it should occur during the fire season. And the wind. They're creatures of the wind. So it's a good match. And we are still now, we're probably in our 12th year working with the American Bird Conservancy, Sustainable Forestry Initiative, particularly international paper, but at least 50 timber companies who work with private landowners now on a very close relationship. That's what the industry looks like. And we get to tell the kite stories, and they all love it. They all love it. And we never have to apologize for asking things of them. They want to know what they can do. And I tell them, thin your forest, number one, burn if you can, if that's part of your regime, but you will have swallowtail kites. Let the trees grow large, let them last long enough. So you always have everything from a clear cut to mature trees on that piece of land. That's good forestry. They already know that. And it fits because it's good with swallowtail kites. At the end of the nest season, swallowtail kites gather in large pre-migration roosts before they migrate to their winter range in South America. Brian Millsap, right here in Tallahassee years ago, was the first, after Susan Cerulean, the first director of the Non-Game Wildlife Program. Non-Game Wildlife Program had a grant program. That's what fueled ARCI's initial work on everything, a lot of the species we studied. This is back in the late 80s. That's what got me started, the funding means to study swallowtail kites. Brian found the first large pre-migration roost. He was a raptor biologist. He still is. Incredible. And he recognized the importance of that and suggested, as they funded us, take a look at these roosts. This is just one of the 5 largest roosts that account for what we think is about 90 to 95% of the US population in late July, peaking in about the 3rd week of July. Every year we've looked at it since 1989. So this is not only a beautiful phenomenon, it's an incredibly useful, what a gift. I had a lot of lucky breaks. This is one of them. How do you monitor the size of your population that you're trying to conserve and manage? You want to know whether you're going in the right direction. Are you doing the right things? You want to be able to count. We do that every year. We still do it. We get up in small planes. We circle these roosts. We take pictures. Gina, bless her heart, counts all those white heads in all of those pictures. And I'll show you in a few minutes where we got to with that. But this is what the first thing we learned by tagging birds at their nests. No, they don't wind up in northern South America. They go all the way down to Bolivia, southern Bolivia, Brazil, down into south central Brazil even. And they turn around 5,000 miles. They turn around 2.5 months later and they come back. They cross 600 miles of ocean over the Gulf. That's tough for a raptor, especially when you're a gliding machine because you're relying on thermal activity. You don't have big thermal. If you're a glider pilot in an airplane, you do not go out and see how the Gulf of Mexico looks today, because you're going to get a real close-up look in a matter of minutes. There's no thermals coming up. The kites can stay up. And when they leave shore, I'm sorry for all this stuff, but every one of these facts, just learning it was so exciting. They leave the southwest coast of Florida for the most part. A lot of almost the whole US population comes down through Florida, and we have at least 2/3 in Florida. They leave the southwest coast in the mid-afternoon. It's going to be dark soon. But by the time it's dark, they're not over the land anymore where all the thermals have disappeared. They're over the Gulf of Mexico, which in July and August is warmer at night than the land. That's what I think. I think that's the connection. I think that's how they can survive 4 days and nights. And we've seen this over the Gulf of Mexico until the wind carries them eventually to the Yucatan Peninsula or some other landfall. After 4 days and nights, they probably run out of the fat they need and the water they need to metabolize the fat, and they don't survive. And we've documented that. It's very poignant. You could write a lot of poems about this stuff, but we've documented that with the satellite tracking. This is the last tracking picture I'll show you, but these are 5 different birds. Count them. I think there's 5 returning in the spring. And when they come up off of the Yucatan Peninsula, some go over to Cuba, some wind up in Alabama, Mississippi, sometimes Louisiana. But look, all 5 of those birds, each of those colored lines ends exactly where that bird nested the year before, every one of them. So they make that long trip back and they go right to where they nested. And what do they find? Well, they found the nest they used last year, but they find other kites because the kites nest socially. They love it. They love to be close, help each other see predators, et cetera, et cetera. They nest close to each other. We call them nest neighborhoods. What else is there? What else are they going to find where they nested last year? Think of Valentine's Day. I don't know. They're going to find their mate because they don't migrate together. They don't winter together, but they go back to the same place. And if they both survive that arduous trip, they start a family again. Cool stuff. I'm sorry. Yes, if they both survive, we don't have enough birds banded to know that for sure, but that certainly appears to be that way. Okay, so this is just some of the recognition. You can find cool stories and lots of great videos, better than my pictures, at any of these sources. And we keep doing this stuff on Swallowtail Kites after all these years, but here's the end of the Swallowtail story and the news I'm happiest to share. Because of those systematic annual aerial counts, that gift of a monitoring method that we have, when we go back and look at our data from 1989 to 2025, back in the beginning, we only knew the whereabouts of one big roost, the one that Brian Millsap found. Over the years, we found more. So from 1989 to 2016, every year we might add a small roost here, lose a bigger one there. The numbers were varying, and it showed like maybe a slowly increasing population. But from 2017 to 2025, 9 years, we've been using exactly the same 5 large roosts, which we think represents about 95% of the US population, using the same methods at those 5 roosts. And from 2017 to 2025, the total count every year has gone up 1 to 3% for those 9 years. And we are now at 30.1% in 2025, higher than the population was in 2017. I don't take any credit for that. We did what we could, maybe it helped, but I think a lot more people know the stories of swallowtail kites, and we need to look no further than public and private land managers to thank for listening to those stories and having the trust to say, we'll give your management recommendations a go. So this feels pretty good. In this area, yeah, there you go. Oh yeah, the question is, where do they nest in the Tallahassee area? Any place there are mature pine forests and diverse habitats, certainly St. Mark's and environs and farther out, and et cetera. They should be pretty easy to find. And to find the nests, you just look for the birds. You look for a bird carrying nest material or prey and note which direction they go. Get your compass out on your phone and say, okay, and then look at a map and say, oh, I'll take a look over here. And then when you get closer, you'll start to hear them vocalizing, and then you might wind up seeing them copulating, and that's a pretty good sign right there. Yeah, I'm glad to tell you more about this any other time, or just give us a call. But yeah, that's good news. Okay, moving on. I decided before I die, and preferably before I retire, it's always struck me as very disappointing that Southeastern Kestrels have declined as much as they have. Southeastern Kestrels are the non-migratory population in the southeastern US. Most of them that remain are in Florida. Some in Georgia, some in Alabama and southern Mississippi, and local public and private land managers have been nudging those populations up a little bit. So, but Florida, we've got most of the remaining subpopulation, the Southeastern Kestrel, which is genetically distinct. They're the only subpopulation that's non-migratory, but they are genetically distinct. They have different measurements and appearances and certainly behaviors. So we are the stewards of this subpopulation here in Florida. And there are a lot of things it struck me over the years. There's so many things we don't know that we're learning about other species that contribute to management, developing management practices that will help. That hasn't been done with kestrels, despite the fact that we can get them to nest in boxes. We can watch them, we can measure things, look at nest success, things like that. So you don't have to memorize this, but this is, I guess, my swan song. This is the big project I always wanted to do. And there's so much community around Southeastern Kestrels that it became possible for me, without even trying, in spite of myself, to start raising money to do this. Not a dollar of that money has come from a state or federal agency. Not a dollar. It's all private money. And that's just a fact. That's what we had to do. We had one foundation in particular, the Wagmore Foundation, which is the largest share of this. But look at the very bottom, special thanks to Alachua Audubon contributed some bequeathals that they had, quite a bit of money. Santa Fe Audubon, same way. Bob Hutchinson, ex-county commissioner in Alachua County, connected me up with the Wagmore Foundation. He is on the board. And now they just agreed to fund us for the third year in a row to try to wrap up this Kestrel project. Can't thank them enough. And you'll see why, because it's expensive to collect a lot of data fast. And when you get old, if you want data, and you got to collect it fast. It's the way it goes. So I also want to point out Mary Dowdell and James Dowdell. I hope some of you may have known them. Mary used to be Roger Torrey Peterson's assistant, primary assistant up in Maine. She came to Florida. She volunteered with FWC, wound up working on red-cockaded woodpeckers. Of course, you probably know kestrels use abandoned red-cockaded woodpecker cavities. Those are their natural nest sites. Mary and James died much younger than we would have ever hoped for. And a few days before Mary died, she said, "We're sending some money your way." That's the financial basis for why we started studying kestrels, why we could do something. And I said, "Mary, what do you want us to do?" And she said, "Save kestrels, because it's not being done." I'm not casting blame. That's Mary's quote. And I know you're not supposed to quote people who are dead because she can't tell you I'm wrong. But she had worked for the state and she saw nothing happening. So I said, "Okay, Mary, well, that's great. I don't know anything about kestrels. Who could help me?" And she introduced me to Marcy Clutter, who's named over there on the left. Marcy is the one who got me studying finding kestrel nests down in Central Florida. Marcy's sitting here and we're married. And Marcy studies native plants. And so I'll mention that in the last slide. But there you go. Gosh, thanks to all these people, because we're working with Audubon chapters, 2 Audubon chapters and with Wacoochee State Forest. Those are the nest box programs that we focus on. And we're trying to build a bigger community in Central Florida to use our heads on where to put nest boxes, concentrations, and arrays, where to give the kestrels the artificial nests they need, because they no longer have 60 to 150-year-old longleaf pines everywhere where they used to, with red-cockaded woodpeckers in them, making cavities. That's why we had kestrels. Now those lands are scarce. So they're listed as threatened in Florida. There's only 32 bird species listed in Florida under the state listing regime. Declined over 82% since the 1940s in Florida, 82%. That's been going on for our lifetimes. Did you know about it until the last few years, relatively? Why? I call it the curse of commonness. This bird was so common, nobody assumed it could ever be in trouble. And yet, wildlife managers knew. They had an inkling. They know what they were not seeing. Good birders still do. So we just had to connect that information and say, wait a minute, we're losing something really precious that's so beautiful, so wonderful, right in our midst, and it's disappearing. So likely causes. Loss of suitable nesting, old trees, loss of foraging habitat. They need big old trees with cavities, natural cavities, near grasslands. So they go out and catch things in the grass, like grasshoppers. If that grassland doesn't burn at least once every 3 years, preferably every 1 or 2, it gets too tall. Kestrels can't go in there and catch prey. If that forest doesn't burn in 1 to 3 years, it's not going to be a healthy forest anymore. Turkey oak's going to come in. Kestrels aren't going to be able to hunt in the grass close to the nest. The young aren't going to be able to find food when they fledge out of the nest. It's all connected. And the last thing, smaller numbers do occur elsewhere, and they're getting some encouraging help. Kathy Thompson, Chris Koch from Hernando Audubon Society introduced us to Kathy a few days ago. And she said, oh, I've got some pictures from a nest box in my yard in Hernando County. Maybe you would like to use them. So just to show you what they look like in case you or your friends don't know. Picture on the left, it's a male on the top and a female on the bottom. You can see the difference in coloration on the breast, more streaking on the female. The males are smaller than the females in most raptors. They are in kestrels. Same pair, same snag, male on top, female on the bottom. You can see the male has blue wings, more blue on his head, the female less blue on the head, and just a brown back with dark stripes. The easiest thing to see is the tail. Look at the male on the upper right, solid reddish brown with that black wide terminal band and a little white band below that. The female, on the other hand, just all brown with black stripes. So this is the happy couple on the same snag, the male at the top and the female at the bottom. So Kathy's gotten these great pictures and just sent them to us this week. So you're the first to see them in the larger audience. You can see how the male is not streaked very much. The subspecies name, Kestrel sparvarius pallus, means pale. So the Southeastern Kestrel, that's their species name, subspecies name. The males are paler, the females are really not very different, but that's how you can tell it's a Florida bird and not one of the many, many wintering birds that at least used to come down to Florida for the winter from all the way up the eastern seaboard. That doesn't happen anymore. I don't know about you, but it's hard to see anywhere near the number of wintering birds that we used to. It's not because we still don't have habitat, it's because they're not surviving where they're born and the migration southward. Conjecture, but probably true. These are good habitats, natural, top center, a burned pine forest, not very old necessarily, but that could have some 60, 70, 80-year-old longleafs in it. Bottom left had some human uses, but still good habitat. Pastures have become very important. A really nice signature of good nesting habitat for Southeastern American Kestrels is that lower right picture where right over here, there might be some clumps of pine trees that woodpeckers have used. So the red-cockaded woodpeckers make a nest hole opening about that big, too small for a kestrel. When they abandon that, other species, larger species of woodpeckers gradually enlarge the opening, and gradually a kestrel can use it. Affiliated woodpeckers will keep making it bigger and bigger. Sometimes they get so big the kestrels could go through 2 at a time, but that means that predators can as well. So those older cavities eventually get abandoned by the woodpeckers and even by the kestrels. They are beautiful. They're like sculpture. Now, right there in the center, that's an X red-cockaded woodpecker cavity. And that's what happens over time. The bark layer curves back in. They make these resin wells, the woodpeckers do, that resin keeps, it discourages snakes from going up and getting in those cavities. That's what red-cockaded on the left. That's John Hoke on the right. He's a senior forest ecologist with Wacoochee State Forest. Let me show you, I think, another picture. Well, John and his assistant, who's now quite experienced, Emily Saylor, work for, sorry to drop names here, but Vince Morrison, and no, Morris, I'm sorry, Vince Morris and Colleen last name. Yes. Um, they are senior forest ecologists who are responsible for bringing red-cockaded woodpeckers back to the Withlacoochee State Forest, which is going to be a world-class, probably a global international conservation site at some point. It harbors one of the best, healthiest red-cockaded woodpecker populations in Florida, and therefore kestrel populations. Vince and Colleen went out. When they got the word back in the 60s, 70s, we've lost red-cockaded woodpeckers almost to extinction because we're not burning habitats that evolved with a natural fire regime once every 3 years at the most. They went out and just started burning everything. These forests were just rank with understory, mid-story species. They turned Withlacoochee into one of the best havens for red-cockaded woodpeckers and now for kestrels as well. So John and Emily are the next generation, and that's who we're working with. Just great, great stuff. Fire, very important, and of course, this is the whole U.S. population now. These are the declines, years at the bottom through 2010. We don't have the Southeastern Kestrel on this slide. It was made by the Peregrine Fund, and they claim they didn't have enough data to show a trend. But in fact, we have other ways of looking at a trend in Florida. This is breeding bird atlas data from Florida. So take a look at the one on the left. This is BBA is Breeding Bird Atlas 1, conducted in the late 80s. And BBA 2 was conducted 2011 to 2017. So a time difference between number 1 and 2. And the thing to look at is if you look at the percent of priority blocks occupied by observers, they noted the percent that were occupied by kestrels during time series 1 in the late 80s, 10% of the priority blocks had kestrels. Bringing us up to current times, more recently, 11. That's not a significant population increase. When we look at the percent of quads that were occupied, same thing, 20.7 to 19. No, it's not statistically significant. There is no evidence that kestrels are increasing in Florida. And yet, I'm sorry to say this, Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission, since we started doing this work, which frankly they weren't doing, they claim that kestrels are probably increasing. They have no evidence. They have no monitoring plan. I'm not trying to disrespect people. They have some wonderful, dedicated people, but this is the message that's coming out, and it's hot off the presses in the last year, and it's not true. It may be true, but we certainly don't know that. There's no evidence that suggests that it is. So moving onward. So here's the objectives of this, what we're now in our 5th year of doing. And I've told you this in other sentences, but we're interested in what is nest success by habitat. How successful are they in different habitats, the contrast you saw, and what's their survival rates? What are the actual numbers? How many make it through fledging into post-fledging? How many are alive a year later when they're ready to nest, natal dispersal? So I'm looking at the second line from the top. The third one, natal dispersal distances. It used to be thought that kestrels only dispersed 3 miles, 3 miles from where they were born. Now that's before habitat was fragmented, continuous ancient pine forests in Florida. If they're only dispersed 3 miles and they are genetically predisposed to only going that far, now they're in a much more fragmented habitat. They may not make it to suitable forest to nest in. That's a concern. So I wanted to know, has that distance changed? Well, in fact, by putting transmitters on these birds, we know that it's twice that. And now if you take a circle with a radius of 3 and you take another circle with a radius of 6 miles, that second circle, it's a square function. So that second circle has 4 times the area of the first circle. Kestrels are dispersing farther than they used to. Is that because they have to, because they've lost habitat? Who knows? But maybe the radios are a more reliable method to gauge it. But I'm telling you all this stuff, just we're looking for We're looking for real knowledge we can sink our teeth in, true facts, things that we can build management recommendations on. So all the way down, so these are the questions that we started out asking, but we're already getting answers on these after 5 years. And for this size of a study, that's good. That makes me go to sleep well at night, knowing that we're already starting to pay off. There's 3 yellow circles there. Withlacoochee State Forest is the bottom one. Alachua County, which includes Watermelon Pond area in the western part of the county, but a larger area, and Etaniah Creek State Forest. Santa Fe Audubon has their nest box program in Etaniah Creek, Alachua Audubon in Watermelon Pond and those other Alachua County sites. And then of course, Withlacoochee Forest stands alone. But those 2 Audubon chapters, they have beautiful nest box programs. So one in Alachua County goes back, it was started by a guy named Bob Simons, who died just about a year ago, a year and a half. He started just putting up nest boxes, and he put them in good places because he was a good naturalist, excellent naturalist. That nest box program was inherited by Alachua Audubon. It's taken over now, being directed by Eric Amundsen, who's just a retired dentist. He's in his mid-70s, and he just doesn't stop. And that's how I got connected with them. This is Bill Chitty and Betty Rosenblatt from Etaniah Creek. Bill started putting up boxes with Betty's help years ago out there in Putnam County. And they've learned a lot about kestrels, and they came to us and said, will you work with us? Will you use these data? Can we learn more together? And then this is Miguel Olvera, who was a volunteer for Alachua Audubon. He worked with Bob Simons. I went out with him and Bob and some other people. That's how I met Miguel. Miguel is now a grad student that I'm working with at the University of Florida. And he's working on his master's on kestrel habitat questions. And so that's our second main collaborator. And then, of course, that's Emily up in a tree, Emily Saylor and Withlacoochee, and John Hoke on the ground. And they will do this all day. They go up and band red-cockaded woodpeckers on these Swedish ladders, 10-foot sections. You climb up there. They'll have a ladder over one arm, a 10-foot ladder over another arm, a 40-pound climbing belt, and a nest box. And why not clip another nest box on this side of the belt and take it up at the same time? So I'm representing all this. I'm telling you the story, but this work is way, way beyond anything I or ARCI could ever do. It's just a beautiful collaboration.
Placed on the tree?
Are some of the nest boxes placed on trees? Yes. Yes, they are. Yes. I'll go back here to this picture of Miguel. So this is called it's an articulating nest box. If you sail boats, and I don't, but it's called a mast chalice. You can lower that pole. It pivots right there at the center. You pull a pin out and you can lower that pole. And as you do, the box is on a swivel and the box always stays vertical. As you lower the pole, it comes down like this. And the eggs and the young stay right there where you want them. Then you can clean. This is what I started doing with Marcy and learning how to do all this stuff. Get it ready for the season. Then you go in there and count eggs. You can use peepers to count eggs. You can get the box down when you need it, when you want to band and put transmitters on the juveniles. So yeah, they're either on trees. If they're not natural cavities, the boxes are on trees or on utility poles sometimes, or those articulating poles. And that's what the inside of a box looks like after it's been used a while. On the left, raptors, falcons, the bigger falcons nest on cliffs. When the young have to defecate, they back up to the cliff and they raise their tail and launch it into space. Keeps the nest clean. Cavity nesting birds don't have that option. So it builds up. The kestrels bend over, raise their tail, and they shoot, and it just hits the wall. And eventually the walls and sometimes part of the ceilings are covered with excrement. In natural cavities, this is so cool, and John and I go back and forth on why could this be. Natural cavities in these pine trees do not have that growth on the sides. They don't smell bad. They don't have little colonies of ants and and all kinds of things. If you put your hand in and take it out, you can sample all the stuff that's in there. That doesn't happen in the natural cavities, and we wonder if it's the terpenes or something in the pine that discourages insects and maybe helps keep them clean or encourages some bacterial function or whatever. So that's very cool. This is just to remind me to tell you that across species, anything that Audubon will tell you can use a nest box. We have to be concerned about how hot it gets in those things because that's increasing. So Marcy and I, this past summer, we were checking boxes and we looked at this one. There's a couple of unhatched eggs. There's 2 nestlings that look dead. They are not dead. They have scraped, their parents have scraped all shavings off the bottom and they are lying belly down, feet straight, stretched back straight, and they're as much contact as they can have at the bottom of that box, probably to stay cool. So we're going to start collecting temperature data in some of these boxes this year. So just some of the people I've mentioned, Gina Ken on the left, Anastasia from Alachua County Environmental. They're a great partner of ours. They don't fund the work at all, but that's okay. They give us access. Gina and Adam, Gina, her husband Adam is not there. That's Miguel in the upper right. Miguel and his academic advisor, Christina Romagosa at UF, Emily Saylor with Wakuchi, and Chase Purtle, rhymes with turtle, who's a savior of gopher tortoises on the Ashton Biological Preserve in Alachua County. Loves kestrels and loves helping us. He never goes to sleep. These are just incredible people. I mean, it's just, it's great to know all this is running out there all the time. And that's part of what I'm trying to convey to you. I'm sorry if I didn't repeat your question for Zoom. There was a question here, do the boxes go on live trees? Yes, they go on live trees and utility poles and poles that we can actually install ourselves and lower the box down. This is a picture of a young female with an amazing tracking device. These are made in Lithuania. They're like little gems. They have a solar panel. They collect GPS fixes, as accurate as you see on your phone GPS when you're driving down the road and you see the driveway up ahead. 10 to 15 meter accuracy. A GPS fix 1 to 3 times a day, depending on how much sun they're getting. Stores that information, and then every day or two, depending on what we set, it calls up through the cell phone system. It calls home and downloads the GPS fixes to us. And we just get this all through email. And if we want to change that duty cycle, or we want to check in on some of the other, how well it's working, we can actually call it up and look at the data. So amazing devices. But by the time we pay the 15% tariff that we're paying now to get this stuff from Lithuania, $1,600 per transmitter. How do we get big enough samples so we can trust the data? Well, that's where those donors come in. And that's the difference, the big difference that the Livermore Foundation made. This is what we've accomplished from 2021 through 2025, 193 aluminum bands. This is all nestlings now, 193 nestlings banded. 94 have been given color bands. 29 carried old-fashioned VHF radio transmitters. You carry an antenna and a receiver, and you go out and you look for them by hand. 29 of them back in 2022 and 2023. 20 of them determined their location only by cell phones, no GPS, but they triangulated. I'll show you a picture next. And they actually work pretty well. These are 3 different technological sources of location data that we were successful using. And 84 at $1,600 a piece, that's how many we've used so far. Cell phone delivery of GPS locations. That's the best, most accurate data. That's data nirvana. So VHF radios, you go up in an airplane and, especially a small plane's got autopilot, you program it to fly these transects exactly, and you listen with antennas out both sides. So we got a lot of good data doing that. These are the ones that triangulate on cell phone towers, no GPS, but the cell phone system actually runs all these algorithms on this stuff over time, and gradually those little green circles get smaller and smaller, and you have a probable nest location. This is very expensive technology too. This is about $1,200. VHF is about $250 a piece, but then you got to pay for the airplane and the technicians. So what all this technology has done is, sorry to say, for young people coming up, but it's made it much more cost effective to collect data without using human observers directly. Well, if you have to have a lot in your sample to be able to trust your data, and you can test that statistically, but it's very disappointing to do work for 5 or 10 years and realize you still don't have enough data to answer a question definitively. And we all, if you're in any kind of science, you'll have to deal with that. So here are some of the results. These are all GPS related now. I love this bird. She was born on Etna Creek State Forest, and her nest is in the upper left corner. I'm sorry, she came from this cluster of blue fixes right above my finger there on Etna Creek. But by her first year, when she was apparently settling into nest, she settled on, this is not a petroglyph or whatever, she settled on Camp Landing bombing range. Had quite a sense of thrill and excitement, I guess. She is still alive. She is just off the bombing range, and with luck, whoever shooting at it from the air is a pretty good shot. So that's the kind of data that we're collecting now. The reason that red-cockaded woodpeckers and kestrels like to use bombing ranges is because they burn on a 1 to 3 year cycle. They burn on like a 1 week to a 6-week cycle because they're getting, big bang. So that's one example. Here's another example of the GPS fixes. This bird was born at the cluster of blue points right on top of that yellow line. And during its first year, it started wandering, and it spent a lot of time here and a lot of time over there. And when it was 1 year old, it moved into that cluster in the upper left to nest. That's the kind of data that tells us how far they disperse, natal dispersal, birthplace to first breeding place. It's not 3 miles, it's 6 miles. That covers a bigger area. But I always thought when people said, oh, kestrels only disperse 3 miles, I thought that meant, well, they get out of the nest in July, and then they start looking around the nest and hunting, and they run out of food, and their parents are gone. They can't hassle them anymore, and they start wandering off. And gradually over the next 6 months, 8 months, they may move up to 3 miles. That's not the case at all. They get out of the nest, and the first thing they do is they go all over. Some of these birds went 53 miles. That bird on Camp Landing on the bombing range, she went there the first week she was out of the nest. And then she went out and explored all these other areas. So they're making decisions about the resources. Are there kestrels there that I could mate with? Is there nesting habitat? And is there foraging habitat? How hungry am I at the end of every day? I mean, every animal, us included, we're measuring how good our environment is by how full our stomachs are, how hungry we are. So what do you do with all that data? You turn it into a home range. How big an area do these birds need? And we are getting close here to finishing, that is. So the red line, you just draw a line around all the outermost fixes, which are those pink circles for this one, for 3 males tagged as juveniles, 3 males. So, but the blue lines are more informative. That's just a statistical way to look at movement data. And if the dots are arranged as they are, those 3 different males, then those blue circles tell you, oh yeah, but they really are using this larger habitat. So it isn't just the immediate area where their fixes were once a day, but it's within that blue. That's how we're making our estimates of home range sizes. How many acres of good habitat do kestrels need? So home range areas, they're bigger than we're thought to be. The 3 males that I told you about, but 17.4 square kilometers. I'm telling you this because years ago, FWC came up with an estimate of home range the area needed by kestrels. Actually, this is pretty recent too, and this is disturbing. 1.5 acres. Well, 4,300 acres. So you've got a listed species that lives entirely in uplands. And what happens to uplands in Florida? They're the first places that get developed. You've got 32 birds on a threatened species list, and there's regulations on whether or not you can build on those lands. Just connect the dots here. Do we want to keep those 32 birds on that list when they're preventing these upland habitats from being developed without addressing some kind of mitigation? That's the sort of things that we have to think about. What's really going on back there? So this is pretty disturbing to me that an agency is putting out estimates of home range. They're calling them territories, which is a very small area. Maybe that's on purpose, but less than 2 acres, when in fact, when we measure them with these devices, they're way bigger than that. Natal dispersal, yeah, so on average about 5.7, almost 6 miles, not the 3 miles that was originally thought. And I'll finish all the data stuff and wrap this up by showing you something that we didn't expect to get, but turned out to be real exciting. These are the home ranges of a few females and a bunch of males. And these are from Alachua County. There were more males produced in Alachua County than females, way more. 3 to 1, three males for every 1 female produced. There's more. I'll tell you what that might mean. So these are the home ranges. The purple ones are females, blue are the males. Look at how small some of the male home ranges are. If you imagine the average size, fairly small. Look at the females. By comparison, the females are covering much, much larger areas. So when we look at that, just look at the yellow print. So these are different ways of measuring home ranges. We're comparing male home ranges with female home ranges, and there's the bottom line. These are young birds just out of the nest in the first 9 months before they attempt to breed. 7 to 9 times larger female home ranges than males. They're covering a huge area. They're dispersing farther than the males. Okay, so that's interesting in itself. There's a sex difference here in how exploratory they are, how far they'll go to nest. But in the field of conservation biology, sex ratios are a cool trick. If we have a species that's disappearing and we see that a lot of different habitats, and we want to know what habitats are best to save that species, what should we be protecting? This is a cool way to get at that question totally indirectly. And I know that, just follow me with this and then it'll make sense. Look at the sex ratios of the birds that all the young birds that we banded in Withlacoochee State Forest in 2025. In Withlacoochee State Forest, about 1/4 of the young birds were males and 3/4 were females on Withlacoochee State Forest. Now come down and look at just Alachua County. Exactly the opposite. 3 to 1 males in Alachua County, favoring males in Alachua County. Now think about those home range sizes and those dispersal distances. The females are covering bigger distances. So chapter 3 of the best conservation biology book, sex ratios. Oh, let's look at sex ratios. Well, if you're a pair of birds or human beings or whatever, and you're nesting in good habitat, you want to favor the sex. You want to produce more of the sex that is not going to disperse, because you know that is good right there where they were born. On the other hand, if you're nesting in habitat that is poor, you're going to favor the sex that disperses a greater distance, because they are more likely to be able to find a mate and find a habitat. That's been in the books and proven, one study after another. And in conservation biology, this is a very interesting, useful way to look at habitat quality. You know, we don't have any other way to know whether this kind of savanna is better than this kind of forest. But if you look at the sex ratio and you know which sex disperses, you can put that together and you can say, savanna, no, that's not good habitat because the dispersing sex is leaving savanna. It's that forested habitat that's better. So when you look at all of this, what it tells us is the habitat in Alachua County, which is less forest, more open pasture and open grasslands, way more than in Withlacoochee State Forest. Decades, maybe thousands of years ago, the forest may have been better habitat where it was open savanna with grasslands that were burning frequently. It's not anymore. It looks like it's not the best habitat, and it's all in that sex ratio data. At least that's our conjecture. Now other people can come on after this and they can test these. They can go out and measure the prey in these different habitats, for one thing. That's a surefire way to do it. What's another way to measure prey? How would you do that if you had 50 nest boxes? Before you answer that question, survival is the last thing I'll tell you about. So we had birds tagged for with transmitters that'll last 1 to 2 years. And what we've learned is that survival of kestrel young is not good. 24% from the year we have the most data so far, 2025. Only 24% of the young hatched lived to be 1 year old. Coincidentally, on some FWC site, they refer to a banding study done by John Smallwood, a color banding study back in the 80s, 90s and early 2000s. And they deduced from their band resightings that first year survival was 20 to 30%. We've done it with transmitters where we have even a more positive conclusion about whether the bird survived. 24% and 25. That's low. That's alarmingly low first year survival for a bird. And that could be one of the main factors, the demographic factors driving the population decline of kestrels. So we have this habitat information indirectly through the sex ratio stuff. We have the tracking data telling us about those dispersal distance. But thanks to Drew Fulton, a part-time employee wizard with ARCI, creating a camera system that Miguel was installing, solar panels down near the ground, a white box with all the brains in it, a big deep cycle battery on the ground. And what we get out of all this is 24-hour-a-day, 7-day-a-week surveillance for the entire nest cycle for 30 nest boxes with this camera system. And what do we see? Well, bear with me here. See if this works. It's not. Stand by. So these are just 4 short, here we go. Yeah. So that male just brought, I think it was a wolf spider, fed it to the female in the nest. Okay, this is another nest. Whoops. What did you do, Marianne?
You want to play that one?
No.
Go back.
Oh, there it goes. It's running. I don't know if it's the same one or not. That male's banded. So he's a young bird from the previous year, and he's mating with an unbanded female. The interesting thing about this video is that when that female started nesting and was getting ready to lay eggs, she was using the box. She appeared to be mated to a different male. But then this male who was born a kilometer away the year before wound up actually appearing to at least bothering birds. I'm not sure this will work, but Never mind. You get the picture. So here we have kestrels looking at the world around them, and what do they see? Some of them see the villages and those other dozen or so even larger developments that are already on the ground out there in central Florida. Where's the habitat in that for Southeastern American kestrels? And this is where one of the joys of learning about kestrels with Marcy was that she's actually a native plant fan of high order and expert at growing them. You know, at the end of these talks, and this, I promise, is the end, people say, what can I do to help? And we used to say, write a letter or go to a county commission meeting, set a good example, talk to your neighbors. Well, now you can put a 4x8 raised bed of native plants in your yard and you can feed birds like kestrels. You will. You'll bring insects you've never seen before, beautiful native insects. And as I've seen at Marcy's house, you'll attract swallowtail kites who are out hunting insects to bring to their young. And they'll come down over your yard because they'll see those swarms of native bees all over those plants that are in the yard. So you really can do something. It's not just a story, it's the truth. So, and I really mean this with gratitude and respect to all the agency people who have spent their careers trying to save these things and fight the politics involved and all the stuff, all the internal everythings. It's a really, really hard job. And many of them are out there doing it as well as anybody possibly could. So if you'd like to get in touch and learn more or just learn anything we can tell you about, please do so. Glad to try to answer any questions from the room here or also that may be in the chat. Okay. Yes. Yeah, a great question. Do they have more than one nest per summer? Yes, what we found is that the nests that start the earliest, the first cycle nest in early March, actually producing eggs, they seem to have a pretty good chance of trying a second nesting attempt. It doesn't mean both of them are successful. But we have one urban nest that Marcy knew about on a school property down in Hernando County. Now, it's been 5 straight years that they have nested twice a year. And out of those 10 attempts, 9 fledged young. Now, if you're trying to grow a population, that's a pretty handy trick right there. So nesting early is really important. So that's a management recommendation. Get boxes out there, have them ready. And if you're mowing, if you're burning, get it done early, they'll find the food, things like that, connect the dots. Yes, okay, Marianne.
Larger territory, male territory. So what's the chance males are maybe population mating with more than one male during the nest?
Right, so for Zoomers, what's the, yeah, I will. The question is, what is the chance that a female is having extra pair copulations, mating with males other than her putative mate? I think the chances are good. I think that's fairly frequent in a lot of wild species. Birds, we know for sure. And we have that little bit of evidence of there were eggs starting in that box and the male was not banded. And then we have some camera data with him coming back, and then all of a sudden, all the camera data shows it was the male that was banded.
And that would genetic.
Right. So that would, yes. So the comment is that would increase genetic diversity in the population. Yeah, they're trying, you know. This is true with so many threatened and endangered species. They're doing everything they can. I know that's anthropomorphizing, but they do have ways to try harder, and we just need to give them a break. And we'll get there. Any other questions from the room? And then we can take a look at the chat. Yes. Is there much of a population up here in the Panhandle? We're in Tallahassee. So Yes, in the Red Hills, um, and into Georgia, actually. And in Georgia, the population they're managing that's continuous in the Red Hills is in large power line cuts where the birds have been nesting in the open ends of the horizontal arms that hold the high tension cables, there's real big wattage stuff going on. Those poles are being replaced now with concrete poles. And so the recommendation, and I think Georgia DNR is working on this, is getting some artificial boxes on those power line poles. My recommendation to them was wherever those 50-mile long power line corridors go through public lands, pine forests that are being burned, put those artificial structures, stage them out from the power lines so that you can have birds dispersing off the power lines into forest nesting sites. Just wherever something might work. Yes.
As tall timbers. Project owners for the birds.
Does Tall Timbers have a nest box program? Does anybody know? I visited, yeah, RCWs, and they keep track of everything. So yes, and I've given 2 talks now, just in the course of this study at Tall Timbers, and they're very keen on what we're learning. I talked to Jim Cox, who's retired now or stepped down, but Katie Richardson replaced him, and she'll carry this on. But Jim took me out to the Wade Tract, the ancient, incredibly beautiful longleaf pine. And here it is, these huge trees and this beautiful, beautiful grass that's, this tall, too tall for kestrels, but they burn it. They burn it at the right time, the growing season fires, and they get it short. And I said, so Jim, you have a lot of kestrels out here. And he said, nope. And I said, well, why? Right after you burn, why wouldn't kestrels move in and nest while the grass is low? And he didn't say anything. He reached in the back of his truck and he pulled out a 6-foot piece of rebar, steel rebar, and he walked over to the base of one of these massive trees and he just pushed it down in the ground about 4 or 5 feet. And he said, loamy soil, this grass gets too tall for kestrels within a matter of a couple of weeks, after, maybe longer, after we burn it. Simple, ecological, put all those points together. Yeah, that's not where kestrels are going to nest. Okay.
You could just read them for everybody here. Natalie Boydston had a couple of comments.
Look at pellets, scat for physical remnants, or DNA and scat. Yeah, good points.
That would be for the birds. Look at the bird scat.
Well, you can look to identify prey for one thing, and also to look for genetic relationships within these nest box populations. Is there too much inbreeding going on? So about a year ago, they have a great program going up on Hawk Mountain, at Hawk Mountain Sanctuary, Pennsylvania, and they have a lot of young volunteers. And they put up this great message. They were just gleeful. They said, "Oh, we have the greatest observation. Bird number red 3 and G4, a male and a female. They're brother and sister, and they were born last year in this box. And this year they came back and they mated and produced eggs in the same box. Isn't that amazing?" And of course, that's wondrous, but not good news, So that's something you can get by looking at genetics more closely. I'm probably not doing a great job of answering that question. Based on the existing data, it seems like the most efficacious way to direct kestrel conservation would be to buy land for conservation or easements versus spending money on GPS tags and banding. Yes, it would, once we know where to invest in those nest sites. That's what we don't have enough data on, hence the GPS tags and the color banding and the tracking. Yes, that's what we're trying to do. We've got all this enthusiasm. It's really easy to organize enthusiasm and effort, volunteer effort with this bird. It really is. But we want to be putting the effort, the box effort, the monitoring, all this into the right places. And that's what we're trying to inform. Seems logical to me. I'm from Kentucky. We don't have pine forests like Florida. Our meadows a good place to put a kestrel nesting box. Are the boxes easy to build? They are easy to build. If you want to build good ones, follow directions, certain size, certain diameter hole. We like overhanging roofs that shade the sides of the boxes. We're now painting the roofs white on the outside, ventilation holes. Believe it or not, agencies get volunteers to build boxes without any of those characteristics. Why not do it right while we're doing it and use something like cedar that's going to last 10 or 20 years instead of local pine that's not. It's going to rot and fall off the tree, especially if you don't take care of them. Oh, by the way, going on in Virginia, Joe Kolowski, who's a biologist with the Smithsonian and still has a job, fortunately, has a great kestrel nest box program going on. And he's having great success talking to wealthy horse owners with large pieces of property that are grazed perfectly and are beautiful kestrel habitat. And he's working with an organization called BEE Friendly Beef. And what they're promoting on pastures is growing forage that is not some non-native species of hay, but instead growing native meadow plants, and creating this forage and this beautiful flowering landscape as well as kestrel habitat. He's doing really cool stuff up there, and it's very different habitat than here, probably more like Kentucky, as the question was referring to. Yes. Question live.
The swallowtail kite. Range you have any insights on that? Is it possible, or
I'm sorry, just the question again, if you would.
the likelihood of range repopulation?
Oh, we didn't get back to that. Thank you. So 21 states, something happened. It might have been cutting bottomland forests for a big furniture industry in the early 1900s. And then post-war, it really blossomed. So what is one of the most beautiful things about swallowtail kite behavior? If you're interested in watching swallowtails, and if one is really beautiful, then say, oh, 5 or 10 are extra beautiful. What is it about swallowtail kite behavior that adds to that allure? They're acrobatic, yes, and they glide over the trees, but they're social. They do everything together. They nest close to each other. We have nest neighborhoods, and they help each other detect great horned owls, their worst predator. It helps them get up in the morning, and the birds that fed well the day before, they're going to be followed by other birds out to good foraging areas, et cetera, et cetera. So social behavior protects them at their nests, alerts them to danger. They forage out together in the day, and that increases their chance of finding swarms of insects and lots of tree frogs and tree snakes. And then they sleep together at night in roosts. When they're getting ready to migrate, they get in these huge roosts, the largest, over 4,000 birds at 2 of those 5 sites. That's incredible. So that's highly social. So you wipe out that population, but you have a remnant population over here in the corner that's producing, and the birds disperse. But okay, a male goes here and a female goes there. And if they're lucky, a male and a female will go over there, and they'll try to nest as a solitary pair. But if they aren't joined by other swallowtails soon, they're not going to stay there. And we do have that from tracking birds. They really want that social community because it's much safer. They eat better, they live longer, et cetera. So it's a beautiful thing, and it works really great, except in this situation where we artificially wipe them out in a huge area. They're going to find that good habitat, but they're not going to succeed at nesting there. So blessing and curse.
That is what happened. Ava's question about where do they have nests here?
Okay.
There was actually one in Indian Head, like a downtown neighborhood, but there were no other kites around.
There you go.
Yeah.
We don't, I would say off the top of my head, we never saw more than 2 years in a row by a solitary pair. And I don't necessarily think they were killed. Maybe their nest failed. They had trouble feeding,
Yeah.
And remember, for a bird, what drives your behavior? What helps you make decisions about what habitat to settle in and where to look for a mate? Your stomach is the first thing. You go there, you don't even have to look for a mate. How well are you finding food for the first 5 days? Okay, then go from there. Let's look for the other resources. Oh, a mate. Oh, a place to put a nest. You bring all that together. We're trying to, regarding that question, why are you doing this? Well, we're trying to find those places so that we can say to people, you want to help? You've got a lot of money. Let's build 500 nest boxes and put 100 here, 200 here. So let's be smart about how we do this and not just say we're doing it, not just say we're busy, but we're doing it smartly. So, yeah.
Have you seen, since we've been in a drought so long and we're in a really bad drought in this area, have you seen any of your data change, or do you see anything that's driving birds to other places? I'm afraid our kites are not going to stick around where they usually do because lack of water.
They won't give up easily. And if they fail for a year, that's not necessarily the death knell for the population. So they are persistent to a point, and there seems to be some trigger there where that point is. And then they are resilient enough to be able to go out and start exploring at the right time. And it's all a matter of probabilities, By the way, the one statistical test I did put up there was for the sex ratio data, and a Fisher exact probability test. Even with that 1 year of data, 25 versus 75% in one place, 75%. That was significant at less than the 0.05 level. So in other words, it's probably not random chance that we got those results. There is something going on there. It's really nice to be able to have just a short-term data set where you can get statistical significance and really say something firmly about something. Boy, I covered a lot more ground than I expected, but you guys are great and excellent questions. Thanks for being. Thanks for caring and doing all you do. I'm smiling.
Oh, I love pictures.
These are not staged.